Hi, my name is Jesse Klein, and this is my presentation on how has Dana White's leadership skills foster innovation and growth within the UFC. A quick background about Dana White himself. He got into boxing when he was around 17 years old, and during that time, he saw a boxing event on TV, which sparked his creativity and got him extremely excited about boxing. And so he continued boxing throughout his early 20s and 30s. In early 1990s, he lived in Boston. He ended up owning and buying a gym in Boston and running that for over 10 years. Eventually, some local mobsters were trying to get money out of him, uh, and so Dana White did not want that. So he immediately sold his gym, sold all of his property. Within 1 week of those people asking for money, he packed up everything and moved to Las Vegas. Las Vegas is where he really started his career within MMA and UFC. The UFC is short term for the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and the term MMA is known as mixed martial arts, so it includes wrestling, jiu-jitsu, and boxing and kickboxing. So there's the entire facet of fighting together in one sport is what this company was about. It's two people in a small arena, and they fight out for around 15 minutes to see who the winner is, either by submission or by the judges scoring cards. And so during this time in the early 2000s, the Ultimate Fighting Champion was having some serious financial problems. They didn't have enough money to pay for regulations, arena time. They didn't have well known fighters. They didn't have really eyes on the company. And so they couldn't get TV spots. Nobody wanted them in their arenas, and so forth. Uh, Dana was friends with these two relatively rich men, the Fertitta brothers, Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta. And so Dana White had this vision of the UFC and loved the sport, and nothing was really going on in his career. So the three of them gathered $2 million and purchased the UFC for only $2 million. A failing company, through his leadership, is now valued at around $20 billion. And so Dana White is the main spokesperson for UFC. The Lorenzo brothers and the investors are really in the background. Dana White has always been the face and the person that talks to the fighters directly if they need help, and help them with hospital bills, help them with rent if they need it, and also just promoting these fights. He's one of the greatest promoters, I would say, of all time. Uh, Dana had a genius idea early on to the UFC to create this reality show called the UFC. So basically, he had fighters that have never really had eyes on them, around 10 on each team, to live in a mansion and to have cameras and live TV, a film crew film them, for them to fight out and to see who's the best of those fighters. And the top winner of that bracket of the whole season would become would get a contract, would get actual money and a yearly contract within the UFC for like 3 to 5 fights, uh, guaranteed pay. And so this was an absolute genius idea and an act of leadership from Dana White, because the highest and the most recognizable early UFC champions, such as Brock Lesnar, which Dana was friends with and personally invited to fight in the UFC, which reinvigorated his career. But these not that known fighters on the low tiers, they didn't have any eyes on them, and no one really cared about them. And so this TV show brought eyes to the TV show. Dana worked directly with these fighters individually, again with doctors, physical trainers, nutritionists, and all these professionals that would work with these people to help them get better. But then when they won that reality show over and over, these fighters became incredible, and people would buy the UFC and would spend money on it to watch these low tier fighters within also these high tier fighters. Here's a quick picture of what the arena looks like. Once the fight starts, it's one judge in the middle, and then two fighters fighting out for around 15 minutes, but if it's a championship, 25 minutes. Here's a quick graph of the sales of money of pay-per-views, but also sales in millions. So around in 2004, I think it was around $2 million in sales when UFC was purchased a few years after. But then you see 2004, 2005 is when the UFC reality show really picked up speed on TV. And so you see an absolute crazy increase in number of sales in millions, starting at around 2 to 3 million, and then 5 years later, over $200 million in sales. And so this money goes directly to these fighters, paying for rent and their families, to the UFC itself, and for paying for sponsors, and to Dana. I would argue that the UFC shows the one of 21 laws of leadership from Maxwell, the law of empowerment. Dana used his money and his platform to empower these fighters that would never have a chance to make it in the sport. They would have had to quit MMA, quit boxing, and get an actual real job at some point because there's not much money in the sport at that time. Uh, Boxing was the only fighting sport that people actually could make an actual living on the lowest tier side. In addition, as I said before, Dana used uh, his leadership skills and his money and power to help people in need. Some fighters had serious injuries they couldn't pay for. Dana paid for those, personally out of pocket. Sometimes these fighters needed a nutritionist bad or help with a rehab for addiction, and Dana used money directly from his pocket from the UFC to help these fighters. Um, I could also argue Dana White uses the power, the another one of 21 laws of leadership, the law of connection. Uh, he used the law of connection within Brock Lesnar to reinvigorate his career, to join the UFC, to make more money, and to get more eyes on him. He also uses his law of connection through his empathy and charisma. Dana White's charisma helps the company get sponsorships. People trust the UFC because of Dana White's ability to have incredible charisma, an incredible way of speaking clearly. Uh, Lastly, I'd say Dana White uses the law of sacrifice throughout his career. He said in many, many interviews that I've seen personally that he would spend 7 days a week working, 10 to 14-hour days in the office, working to get these fighters paid, getting fights happen, finding arenas, finding nutritionists, finding all these things that will directly help these fighters. And so he sacrificed his family life, he sacrificed friends, and he sacrificed money from his pocket. They put so much money from their own pockets back into the company to grow. Thank you for listening to my presentation.